A blizzard seemed to bury everything. A mother bear and her two cubs appeared, desperate and cold, sheltering under the eaves of the house. David, a photographer, was sitting in a warm room when he suddenly heard a strange sound. He hurriedly took the lamp and looked outside. When he saw that scene, he did something that made everyone panic. A vast, white blanket stretched across the Alaskan landscape as far as the eye could see. Snow draped every pine tree, every rocky outcrop, and every rickety post along the solitary trail leading to David Anderson's cabin. The wind shrieked in relentless gusts, sending whirlwinds of powder snow spiraling through the darkness. It was late February, the heart of winter, and the forecast had predicted one of the most brutal storms in recent memory. A storm so fierce, it threatened to bury everything in its path. David peered through his frosted window, the thermometer outside reading a staggering -50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the night had only just begun. His breath condensed on the glass, forming delicate crystals that mirrored the wild, icy terrain. Although he had lived in this remote corner of Alaska for 5 years, he had never witnessed a blizzard of this magnitude. The snow fell in thick sheets, each gust of wind rattling the wooden cabin, as if nature itself were testing its fortitude. David Anderson once led a very different life. Growing up in Bellevue, he had lived amid the clamor of traffic, the neon lights of downtown, and the constant hum of people rushing to and fro. He worked as a wildlife photographer for nearly a decade, capturing majestic shots of wolves, elk, and occasionally bears in national parks across the Pacific Northwest. Yet, something about the city eventually wore him down. The endless noise and the tight scheduling of assignments whittled away the peace he had once discovered in photographing animals in their true habitats. Yearning for a more authentic, undisturbed connection with the wild, he had sold nearly all his possessions, purchased a modest cabin on a tract of land 4 hours away from the nearest town, and moved to Alaska. Some called it escapism. David considered it self-discovery. The snow-laden wilderness, the fresh air, and the quiet hours spent reading by the fireplace had seemed an idyllic antidote to the breakneck pace of his old life. Until this night, as the storm threatened to swallow his little refuge, he wondered if he had miscalculated the severity of this wild land. Before quitting his job, David had traveled extensively across North America, drawn by the allure of photographing creatures in their natural environments. Grizzly bears catching salmon, moose wading through marshes, and wolves traveling across frozen lakes. These images adorned the walls of his small living space. Even in the lonely months, they comforted him, reminding him of why he had traded convenience for near-complete isolation. His daily routine in Alaska had become second nature. Wake up early to stoke the fireplace, check the weather radio for any severe bulletins, maintain the generator's fuel levels, and keep backup heating systems in good repair. He had a well-stocked pantry of preserved foods, though on nights like this, when the wind howled and snow pummeled the cabin, he sometimes questioned whether even these precautions were enough. During the late morning, David's trusty weather radio sputtered with static-laden urgency. A cold front from the far north had begun merging with other cold airflow, creating a polar vortex that promised to plunge the region into record-low temperatures. Powerful winds could snap even the thickest pine trees like toothpicks. David wasted no time reinforcing his cabin's shutters and checking every gap in the walls where icy gusts could penetrate. By late afternoon, the sky had taken on a steel-gray hue, and the temperature, already perilously low, continued its rapid dive. While he had always embraced the elements, often marveling at how harsh weather could still be so beautiful, he now felt a cold dread. The approaching storm was like none he had encountered before, and its wrath had only begun to manifest. Life in the Alaska wilderness had changed David in profound ways. Gone was the restless impatience of city living. In its place was a practiced stillness. He had learned to trust his instincts, read the signs of changing weather, and remain ever alert to potential dangers. Self-reliance was a cornerstone of surviving out here. There were no friendly neighbors or bustling shops just down the street. The nearest ranger station was 50 miles away, with roads that could become impassable at a moment's notice. Despite these hardships, David felt a measure of peace in the solitude. The pressing concerns of daily existence were simple: maintain warmth, ensure a steady food supply, and stay safe from the elements. Unburdened by the usual urban anxieties, he found clarity in this stripped-down way of living, even as the storm tested his resolve. Evening arrived with little fanfare besides darkness descending like a curtain over an already sunless day. The snowfall escalated, and the shrieking winds slammed into the cabin from all sides. David double-checked the windows, which shook with the force of the gale. Outside, visibility dropped to nearly zero, and the swirling whiteout condition made it impossible to distinguish sky from ground. He braced himself for a long night. After a simple meal of canned soup, he positioned himself by the fire with a battery-powered lantern, flipping through an old adventure novel. He found it impossible to concentrate. With each gust, a new wave of anxiety coursed through him, the knowledge that an unpredictable, devastating force of nature raged just beyond the thin walls. Close to midnight, when the wind's constant roar had become a haunting lullaby, David detected a noise that made his heart skip a beat, a deep, low growl. Initially, he thought it might be the wind swirling strangely around the corners of the cabin. But there it was again, a resonant, ominous sound that no mere gust of wind could replicate. David quickly set the book aside and grabbed a powerful flashlight, creeping to the window. Shining the beam through the swirling snow revealed nothing at first. Then, in the corner of his vision, he sensed movement. He strained his eyes, and the light caught 3 dark shapes lumbering toward the porch. His mind reeled. It was a mother bear with 2 cubs. The very idea that a bear would be active in this ferocious storm, especially during hibernation season, indicated a dire situation. As he watched through the haze of snow, David's heart twisted with concern. The mother bear staggered, each step seeming more labored than the last. The 2 cubs, smaller than average, clung close to her flank, trembling. Their fur bristled with icicles, and each breath they exhaled crystallized in the frigid air. It was clear they were nearing a breaking point. An animal out in such a storm was in deep trouble. David flicked off his flashlight momentarily, hoping not to alarm them. Yet the wind was so fierce that if they had not been desperate, they would never have approached a human dwelling. Something had gone terribly wrong with their den, forcing them into the unrelenting cold. Adrenaline surged through him, a mix of awe, compassion, and a tinge of fear. A mother bear defending her cubs in normal circumstances was dangerous enough, but now, weakened by the cold, her behavior could be unpredictable. Through the window, David observed the mother's futile attempts to dig at the snow near his porch, try to create a windbreak, but the forceful gusts scattered the snow each time. One cub collapsed momentarily, then staggered back up, spurred on by the mother's gentle nudge. The second cub huddled closer, barely able to keep its eyes open. David's heart pounded. He knew enough about wildlife to recognize the signs of hypothermia. If these bears remained out in the storm, they would not last much longer. His immediate impulse was to help, but every rule he had ever learned regarding wild animals, especially large predators, screamed that this was a risky, ill-advised move. He paced back and forth inside his cabin, arms folded tightly. On one hand, his wilderness training and countless official guidelines prohibited feeding or interfering with wild animals. Doing so could lead to dangerous habituation and put both humans and animals at risk. On the other, the heartbreak of watching a mother bear and her 2 cubs slowly freeze to death, mere steps from his warm interior, was too much to bear. His mind raced to possible solutions. If he stayed put, they would almost certainly die. If he intervened, he could be risking his own life. And yet, ignoring their plight felt inhumane, a betrayal of the empathy that had guided him to become a wildlife photographer in the first place. In a surge of resolve, David decided that he could not simply stand by and watch these creatures perish. He would try to save them, even if it meant bending or outright breaking the untouchable rules of wilderness etiquette. As a compromise, he recalled that his cabin had a small insulated storage room, separate from the main living area, originally meant to store extra camera gear and supplies. It had a separate entrance, making it feasible to shepherd the bears inside without bringing them into his living quarters. His mind made up, David donned his thickest parka, layered gloves, and protective gear. He assembled blankets, a large portable heater, and several containers of hot water in the storage room. He couldn't risk having the mother bear inside his main space, but if she could be coaxed into the storage room, at least it might offer them a fighting chance in this storm. Breath steaming, he worked at a fast pace. The storage room was about 10 feet by 10 feet, walls lined with old shelves and crates. He switched on a backup generator that powered a small electric heater. The temperature inside rose from sub-zero to tolerable after a few minutes. He placed blankets on the floor, hoping that any sign of warmth would entice the bears. In the back of his mind, he knew the dangers. If the mother bear saw him as a threat once cornered inside, she could lash out. But, judging from her weakened state and the desperation in her eyes, her biggest concern at this moment seemed to be keeping her cubs alive. With the storage room prepped, David carefully cracked open his front door. A wall of frigid air and blowing snow slammed into him. Barely able to see a few feet ahead, he spotted the mother bear sprawled near the porch, her cubs huddled beside her. She lifted her massive head. Her eyes, glassy and exhausted, locked onto David. Even in that dire state, her protective instinct flickered. His heart hammered, but he moved closer, slowly and deliberately. He gently laid a blanket a few feet away from them, then retreated to the storage room door, leaving it propped open. Warm air wafted into the frozen night. The mother bear attempted to rise, her legs trembling as she steadied herself. She nudged the first cub, which barely responded. With surprising delicacy, she clamped her jaws around the corner of the blanket David had dropped, trying to drag it around her cubs. Perhaps she recognized it as a source of warmth, or maybe she was just following primal instinct. Step by painstaking step, she shuffled toward the open storage room. Snow clung to her fur in ice-crusted clumps. Each time a blast of wind battered them, she would pause, stoically shielding her cubs. She appeared to sense that this place, this small warm pocket, was their best chance of survival. David stood aside, pressing himself against the cabin wall, barely breathing. If the bear panicked or changed her mind, it could be disastrous. But she persisted, half pushing and half dragging her cubs until all three crossed the threshold. As soon as they were inside, David gently closed the door, leaving it open just a crack for him to peer through. The mother bear collapsed onto the blankets, her sides heaving, and her cubs lay huddled against her. With the door mostly shut to keep out the storm, the heater gradually raised the storage room's temperature to a much safer level. Through a tiny gap, David watched as the cubs began to stir under the layers of blankets, faint shivering overtaking their still forms. The mother bear's eyes fluttered, her breath ragged. Yet, as minutes turned into hours, their breathing grew steadier. Their trembling became the sign of life returning to bodies that had nearly succumbed to the cold. The storm raged outside for 3 long days, far longer than initially predicted. Wind speeds soared, and drifts of snow piled high against the cabin walls. Twice, the generator faltered, prompting David to rush outside to fix it, braving the howling maelstrom. Inside the storage room, the bears endured. The cubs gained enough strength to playfully shift around, though they remained cautious, always staying close to their mother's side. David provided the bare essentials to keep them alive, conscious of the delicate balance. He knew that getting too close or offering too much food could alter their natural instincts. Nonetheless, as the storm wore on, a strange kinship formed. The mother bear, though inherently wild, seemed to sense David's intent was not harmful. On the final night of the storm, snow whipped against the cabin windows with such fury that David wondered if the old building could hold out. He slept fitfully, a rifle within reach, not out of malice but necessity. He trusted the mother bear to a point, yet recognized that a wild animal's behavior could shift without warning. Still, no cry or threatening growl pierced the darkness. On the morning of the fourth day, a pale light filtered through the cracks of the shutters. David dared to open the front door, heart thumping. The world had transformed into a crystalline wonderland. The trees bowed under heavy snow, and the temperature had begun to climb, if one could consider a mere -15 degrees Fahrenheit an improvement. The winds had quieted, leaving the landscape in a hush of fresh snowdrifts. Inside the storage room, the cubs were bright-eyed, huddling together as they observed David, who entered slowly with a container of water. Their mother roused herself, standing tall on all fours for the first time since arriving. Her fur was matted but free from icy crusts, thanks to the room's steady warmth. She eyed David for a lingering moment, and though he knew better than to read too much into an animal's expression, he sensed a kind of acknowledgement. It did not take long for instinct to call them back outside. The mother bear sniffed the air at the small opening David made in the storage room door, sensing the calmer weather. She nosed one cub forward, then the other. The storms had subsided enough for them to attempt a journey back into the wilderness in search of a proper den or territory. As they left the warmth of the storage space, David stepped back, giving them full passage out into the brilliant white landscape. When they reached the yard, the mother bear paused. She turned her head and looked at David and put one hand in front of her chest, as if thanking him, who stood on the threshold of his cabin. One last wary glance, or something deeper, a silent show of gratitude that transcended species. Then, with measured steps, she ambled forward, cubs trailing behind, disappearing among the snow-laden pines. David stood in the open doorway for a long time, numb to the cold despite the lingering sub-zero temperature. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the memory of those desperate hours lingered. The moment he first spotted the bears near his porch, the trembling cubs, the mother's unwavering resolve. He felt a surge of emotions, a mix of relief, triumph, and humility. He had broken every rule that regulated human interaction with wild animals, risking his own safety. Yet, in doing so, he saved 3 bears. He went back inside, closed the door, and gazed at the photographs lining his walls. Wolves on a snowy ridge, a moose drinking from a mist-shrouded river, and a grizzly fishing in summer rapids. Images of the wild, once just pictures for magazines and coffee table books, now carried a deeper resonance. He had lived a moment that most wildlife photographers only ever captured from a distance. His thoughts turned toward the broader implications. How humans and animals share a fragile world, teetering on the edge of survival when the extremes of nature bear down. The rules were designed to protect both, and they served a crucial purpose. Yet sometimes compassion intervenes where rules cannot, bridging the gulf that often separates people from the creatures with which they share the planet. In the weeks that followed, the snowdrifts receded, revealing the footprints left by the bears, a faint trail that led into the forested expanse. Each day, David ventured outside to gather firewood, occasionally scanning the distance for any sign of the mother bear or her cubs. Though he did not see them again, he felt their presence in the quiet hush of the forest, a subtle reminder of that extraordinary night. Whenever he lit the fireplace in the evenings, the warm glow on the cabin walls reminded him of how a single act of kindness had saved 3 lives in the midst of the worst winter storm he had ever experienced. He recorded his observations in a battered journal. The temperature that night, the length of the storm, the details of the bear's condition. This journal entry concluded with a short sentence that encapsulated his realization. Sometimes empathy is the best survival tool. His story soon spread among the local ranger community, though many frowned upon his breaking of the established no interference rule. Some argued he had taken an unnecessary risk. Others quietly admired his decision, understanding that nature, while deserving of respect, also benefits from compassion, especially in extraordinary circumstances. Eventually, David found a new sense of purpose. Beyond documenting wildlife solely with a camera, he recognized that his presence in this wilderness might serve as a guardian, albeit only in the rarest of instances. He continued to live alone in his cabin, forging a deeper respect for the environment and all its inhabitants. And each day, he would look at the footprints outside his window, or the memory of them, reminded that, for one brief moment, the barrier between man and bear had dissolved. Share your feelings when you saw David saving the bears in the comments section, and if it were you, how would you handle it? Subscribe to the channel so we can notify you when there are new videos.